Okay, everybody, we are going ahead to get started because it is 5 o'clock and the producer in me says it's time to go, right? 3, 2, 1. All right. So, thank you so much for being here today. This is a project that is near and dear to our hearts. And I'm so glad that you decided to join us. I know you were hoping for warmer weather, but at least we got some sunshine, which was really great. So I'm Ava Thompson Greenwell, a broadcast video professor here at Medill, and your moderator for this evening, for this, what I'm calling double anniversary and double celebration. For nearly a decade, I've been co-directing Medill's South Africa Journalism Residency program, along with Professor Douglas Foster, who's been leading the program almost since its inception. Later, you'll learn more about how former Dean Lauren Giglione, who is sitting right next to him, founded the program at 2 other universities and then brought it to Northwestern. Lauren, thanks for getting on a plane this morning. I heard that you were an hour delayed, but I'm so glad that you could be here for this occasion. Yes, let's give him a hand. Former Dean Lauren Giglione. So a year ago, I began thinking about how we would celebrate 2 important anniversaries in 2023. The first being the 20th anniversary of our journalism residency program in South Africa, and the second being the 30th anniversary of Nelson Mandela's visit to Chicago, which we'll observe this July. I thought it would be fitting to acknowledge the 2 events today, April 27th, which in South Africa is celebrated as Freedom Day. Now, one of the things we have to remember is that on this date in 1994, blacks in South Africa finally had the right to vote after political apartheid ended in the country. Notice I say political apartheid ended because there is still, just like in this country, racial apartheid going on in South Africa. Now, since we're 7 hours behind South Africa time, many there have already acknowledged Freedom Day's 29th anniversary. It's a little over midnight there, so for those of you who chose to stay up to help us celebrate, thanks for joining us virtually. Besides saying thank you to Doug and Lauren for working hard to sustain this program, and I do mean hard, I'd also like to officially welcome Professor Ariane Nettles, who joined us in January as our newest co-director. Ariane had another commitment this evening and was unable to join us, but she will watch the recording later. And Ariane, I just want to say thank you for saying yes. Now let's hear from former participants of the South Africa Journalism Residency Program and how their lives changed because of their experience some 8,000 miles away from Evanston.
The biggest lesson that I learned was to be fearless, kind of like get out of my comfort zone and good things. I think as someone who was always kind of social justice advocacy focused, investigative journalism was something that I wanted to explore, and being able to practice it in another country, I felt like was really fun and exciting and kind of reinforced that that would be the path for me. And I think also employers appreciated that I had that experience and found it interesting, and that helped me get an investigative journalism job after college.
I wasn't planning on going into journalism until I went to South Africa. So I was planning on doing the Medill to law school route. That's a very popular and common. And I just figured journalism wasn't going to be for me. It wasn't going to be a profitable career path, but it was working at the Star in Johannesburg that really made me catch the journalism bug and made me really recognize that journalism is what I want to spend my life doing.
I knew I wanted to be a journalist, but I didn't know how or in what way. And my friends encouraged me to apply for this JR opportunity, and it was life-changing. I mean, it was, of course, just one of the highlights of my time at Northwestern by far. And I ended up doing a lot of international reporting. After that trip, I did an AP internship in Nairobi, Kenya, which I'm sure I was more competitive for because of my experience reporting in South Africa.
Almost every day I'd be out with incredibly talented photographers, out in the townships, out in the halls of power, doing kind of what in the US would have taken me much longer in my career to kind of get to be able to do. And so I think the speed at which we learned, or were forced to learn while out reporting kind of in the field in Johannesburg especially, was simply couldn't match that experience in other kind of undergraduate programs.
A lot of the work that I was doing was focused on townships, on lack of resources, but with like a very human angle. And I've definitely tried to maintain that attitude in all the reporting that I've continued doing since.
But when I went over to South Africa, I was kind of embedded in a show called Against All Odds. And it was a 15-minute weekly human interest documentary show. I got to pretty much go all around Johannesburg, interview hosts of people from all different walks of life, different genders, colors, creeds, shapes, and sizes. And that was my jam. So I finally realized that, hey, there is a space to do the kind of work that I wanted to do. I just had to fly 2 hemispheres to find it.
One of the biggest things that I learned was that there are so many stories to tell around the world. And as somebody who had not spent much time abroad, when I was going to South Africa, it really opened my eyes to just how much potential there was and how many people can get a voice through the kind of work that we do as journalists. I was being treated like any other reporter. I had to go in and pitch stories and sometimes get them greenlit and a lot of times get them turned down. For me, it just made me want to do this job even more. And I remember that rush that I would get when I had a story that was on air on the evening news at the time on ETV. I just loved that feeling, and it made me really want to pursue that career.
I'd barely been out of the country before. So covering things, from politics to energy service and everything else in the country, I really had no sort of framework for, and that meant asking very simple questions, repeating questions to make sure that I knew enough to service a South African audience, despite not being South African myself.
And I continue reporting about HIV issues today because of the expertise that I developed while I was in South Africa. So when I was in Johannesburg too, that's where I really had to run up against people in government and beyond who were obstinate and refusing to give information. And then my senior year at Medill, that's when I focused on doing investigative initiatives.
My first boss told me that he hired me because I had that AP internship under my belt, and he knew I could do it. He knew if I could make it in Nairobi, Kenya, that I could do any job here in the US.
Going to South Africa gave me just a much deeper understanding of inequality, which is kind of what I've gone on to write about in a lot of my work. I think it made me think more critically about questioning power through my work.
I would say much of my career development came in South Africa and came through working at the Star and Saturday Star and various South African newsrooms. After I graduated college, I actually went back to South Africa and lived there for a while, kind of building off of the media partnerships and story ideas and everything that came from my time on JR.
I mean, we all know what it's like to be at Medill and have that larger network, but to have more of a tight-knit group was something that I found to be really valuable, and kind of figuring out how to be adults together at the same time. We all lived in a house together in Melville in Johannesburg, and we would trade recipes that we were cooking for ourselves. And that was really fun. And that's something that I've really carried into my work now. So my job now is all about networking and finding journalists, finding finding the right journalists to bring into our newsroom who have a diversity of experiences. And so that experience of all of us coming together from different backgrounds and learning alongside each other, that's the spirit that I take with me now.
I think doing JR in South Africa showed me like how issues communities face in America aren't necessarily unique. I think doing international reporting helped me realize that there are various communities around the world going through similar plights or like the same types of issues. And it really kind of reinforces how institutional structures and how government can have a role in continuing to perpetuate inequality.
You just kind of sharpen your instinct for people. And because it's across a different culture, you learn to read people better because you have to take in so much more of the nonverbal communication.
I think probably the biggest lesson I learned during my JR in South Africa that I've carried with me is the importance of humility and having an open mind and a learning mindset wherever I go.
That for me was the first time I had been in South Africa, the first time I had been that far from home, the first time I had really been immersed in a different culture. And that can be amazing and fun and exciting. And it can also be really challenging and hard. And there are moments when you want to withdraw and not be part of it. And that just reminder that that's part of the experience, is going through the highs and going through the lows of it. And I think about that often. That's that reminder to keep challenging yourself and putting yourself in those situations.
Yeah, I think the most memorable experiences I had was like getting to know my fellow classmates. There were a lot of people who I didn't know before the trip who I'm still friends now with because of the trip. So being able to spend time with people, being able to do things together on the weekends or after school, I would say that was like probably my favorite part about the experience.
There's just like a bond that forms when you go to another country together and you're trying to report and you're trying to live life. And real and separate from reporting, the safari that we got to go on, that was a life-changing experience, being able to see like incredibly rare wild dogs and lions on the street.
It was the trip to Kruger National Park, and we were at a camp that was called like Oliphant's Camp or something. It was something about elephants. I just remember going outside on the balcony of the cabin and looking up, and you could actually see stars. And then I distinctly remember hearing just this river beneath us flowing, and then I heard, I think it was buffalo or something. It was just like their calls, and I heard their calls. And I just remember thinking to myself, what did this little kid that, you know, I was born in China, what did this little kid in China do? Or yeah, what did he do to deserve to be in a place like this? I just felt extremely grateful.
About halfway through the program, I was in Johannesburg, and a man named Walter Sisulu, who was a contemporary of Nelson Mandela, died. And the news director said, "Julie, we want you to do a story as part of our coverage on what it's like to be an American experiencing this funeral, this moment for the country." I said, "Sure, fine. As long as I can go, I'm happy to do it." And so I remember getting out there at this huge stadium. The funeral was at a soccer stadium, and driving in the news van, and there were just people literally walking for miles and miles and miles to come, and getting to the stadium, and it was completely packed. And Mandela was still alive at the time, and we were there in the stadium, and there was singing and dancing. It was so celebratory of Sisulu's life. And at one point, Mandela gets up on stage. He was quite old at the time still, and he gets up on stage and he starts dancing. And the way the crowd just erupted, you could just feel this incredible energy. And I will just never forget that moment. I get chills kind of just thinking about it. And it was both being there, but also getting to experience this history. You felt like you were part of this history of this country, which was still very fresh, so fresh that Mandela was there still in the middle of it. And it was a real privilege to be able to be a part of that moment.
I would say that while the program was fun and was exciting, it was adventurous, it was always done with an air toward doing things the right way and being cognizant of how journalism is done, and the flaws and shortcomings in journalism. And so just a huge thank you to Doug and to Lauren and everyone else for approaching the subject and the country that I think we've all grown to love with such compassion.
So let's thank Doug and Lauren, because Mark certainly did. I'm wondering, seeing all these people who were your former students and some of my former students, what does it make you think of?
I think both of us are going to weep later, and maybe not on stage, because when I think about all of them, all those students, and the way they presented to us in the beginning, and the difficulty of deciding, is this person ready for a triple level challenge? And being so wrong most of the time. I mean, the ones who were on the cusp for me saying, never, I'm not going to take responsibility for that kid going to Johannesburg. And then seeing what they made of it. That's the main thing that strikes me, is how we were kind of feeling our way in, I'll be honest about it, a faculty and a school that was deeply skeptical of what Lauren had started. A lot of resistance, a lot of sense that these newsrooms aren't as good as the newsrooms students would go to in the U.S. And so to look at that montage that your students put together is just like, it's pretty close to heaven.
Yeah.
Lauren?
Doug says I'm supposed to turn this thing on. Yeah. Well, it's very emotional for me. The students were not always greeted from the beginning with enthusiasm. Julie Pace was the only broadcasting student in the first group of 8 to go to South Africa. And I remember the ETV manager in Cape Town saying to me, she will not be allowed to go on air because she speaks American English, and our audience is not going to necessarily understand or appreciate the fact that she's on our program. And she was so good that she worked her way into doing segments on air. Somebody mentioned humility. I thought the students were really very thoughtful about admitting, as I admit, that we know very little and we have a lot to learn in South Africa. And they were really good learners. I think that was, very important to me, that they absorb everything and take it back. And I also want to mention, since HIV/AIDS reporting was mentioned, that Carol Zazilski, who's in the audience here, please stand up. I would just want people to see you. So she's an expert from the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, who specialized in sexually transmitted diseases in Chicago. And then she would come to this class and talk about HIV/AIDS everywhere in the world from her experience. And I felt that we did the best we could to prepare students to talk about the most important, to learn about the most important things in South Africa and also in this country as well. I mean, I think right now, and I'll stop because I know I'm going on too long here, but when you look at COVID, vaccines, only 3% in Africa, 11% vaccinated in South Africa. They were manufacturing the vaccine in South Africa, but they weren't able to get the shots, or they weren't getting the shots. I mean, this kind of issue of economics and what is our role in using all these vaccines, and when they're not necessarily available to South Africans in the same way. So anyway, thank you.
So you mentioned the students in HIV. So just today, I was reading the log of this one of the 6 students who is in Johannesburg right now, and they were reporting a story on HIV and how far the country has come in terms of testing people, but also getting them medications. So this is a story that certainly continues. We are now going to take a look at those current students. There are 6 students in Johannesburg, and they sent a little video to let you know how they're doing.
Hi everybody, my name is Will. I am a 3rd year Medill student, and I'm one of the 4 students here in South Africa that is writing at the Daily Maverick. I am in the Maverick Citizen section, which is kind of like the human rights social justice section of Daily Maverick. And I guess if I was kind of gonna sort of give like a review of my experience so far, I just like been really enjoying it. I have really liked it here. That people have been so friendly, and I think that like I've learned so much, both like in the newsroom and shadowing reporters on stories and doing research for stories and talking to sources, but also just kind of like being here and sort of the everyday interactions that I've had. I think I've gotten just so much like contextual knowledge that like I never could have picked up, even though I did a lot of research and obviously in class before coming here. And so, yeah, I'm really happy with the experience, and I'm looking forward to kind of these next couple of weeks to keep learning more and getting to cover more stories and speak with different communities and keep sort of building some of the relationships with the reporters that I've been working with at the Daily Maverick.
Hi, everyone. It is currently April 16th. In Joburg, and it's been quite a fun time. We are currently dealing with stage 6 load shedding, and so Abigail's B&B has been dealing with periodic outages throughout the day, at least 3 times a day. The other individuals at Sunbury have not been dealing with load shedding at all, and so that kind of just showcases the differential between South African citizens. It can be quite problematic when we have stories to write and I have to go to a coffee shop or go into the office in order to charge and get Wi-Fi at times. I'm currently working on an investigative piece looking into the recent murder and rapist prison escape, Thabo Bester, and the G4S private company prison system that has had a vast array of scandals related to prison breaks and worker issues. So that's kind of where I'm at. It's beautiful here, it's warm, the gardens outside are gorgeous, and we're within walking distance of Spar, which is a small grocery store in South Africa. So yeah, it's been a good time.
Hi everyone, my name is Yaming. I'm one of the students at the Daily Maverick this quarter, and it's been really, really lovely. I think the city of Johannesburg is so fast-paced, but it's been really good to just meet so many warm and lovely people. I think the people are just more friendly, always willing to help, always willing to like make a joke, laugh around, and it's just been the best time, honestly. And outside of Johannesburg, there's a lot of like beautiful nature to explore, and it's just so good to kind of take a break from our Evanston campus and like just see something else. In terms of journalism, I've been doing a story about crime and kind of how people feel about crime and what makes them feel safe across different neighborhoods. And as someone who's interested in reporting on race and social justice issues, as well as does a lot of work in the critical race departments at Northwestern, it's just been a really enriching and eye-opening experience. And I've been loving it. So thank you. Excited to see what else I'll accomplish.
Hi, I'm Michael Bartholomew. I'm an intern for the Daily Maverick, and there's a little bit of taste of my South Africa. I mean, first off, this view is just like pristine. Where's Ira? She was somewhere over there. We lost her. Anyway, so far it's been fantastic. I mean, the opportunity to see zebras on the weekends is unlike any other. As an animal fan, as a little kid, this is a dream come true for me. And the work's not too bad as well. The reporting job is really interesting. It's already really rewarding. It feels like what we're doing is really making an impact in people's lives. It's a lot of personal stories, and it's a lot of stories that truly matter that just go underreported. And so far with the Daily Maverick, it's been fantastic for me. The office is nice. This garden at home to wake up every morning to is chef's kiss. and again to see zebras on every weekend. And we went bungee jumping. I'll throw out a picture there because no, I'm not doing it again. But woo. All right.
Hey everyone, I'm Natalia, saying hi from here at Sunbury B&B. Just taking some time to read outside. The JR so far has been going great. I'm currently working in the Our Burning Planet OBP section of Daily Maverick, which basically is just environmental reporting. So I've learned a lot since being here. I actually went to court and saw a trial, a small independently owned solar powered company is taking ESCOM to court over how much electricity, self-generated solar electricity they can use and pump into the grid. I'm currently reporting a story on a road that's being built through protected wetlands. Yeah, just a lot of environmental stuff, learning a little bit about like the processes here, how those things happen legally. And it's been really fantastic. A lot of fun free time too, hiking, shopping, partying, all of the usual stuff. It's been really great. Happy Freedom Day.
Hello, I'm Hannah. I am a third-year student here at Northwestern, studying journalism and international studies. And over this 3 months in Johannesburg, I'm reporting with Health E News. And over the span of last 3 weeks, I've been able to go into townships, reporting on ambulance shortages, as well as I'm working on a story right now on the mental health struggles and the stigma attached to it for a lot of the health workers here. So overall, it's been a very humbling experience, whether it's during load shedding, there's no electricity, and my last LED light goes out and I have to work in the dark, or when I go into township, I couldn't communicate with the locals and I have to rely on my colleagues to speak to Zulu and conduct the interviews and ask her to translate them for me. It's an experience that I'm constantly checking my privilege as a person who is able to study in the US and travel all around the world to come here and to have a lodging, have living support from my parents. I really feel lucky, and I really hope to tell more stories here and yeah, just embrace this experience.
So I think what stands out for me in doing these videos is just how appreciative students are for their experience. And I saw Sam sneak in there in the back. He missed seeing his video there, but we'll catch him a little bit later. But, you know, checking their privilege, doing stories that they probably would not get a chance to do here in the US. Several of those students already have had, at least one has had a front page story. And the stories that they have done have been very comprehensive. And so to that person who said those newsrooms wouldn't be as good, right, they were wrong. Talk a little bit about how you, as you were sending students there, sort of what your hope was for them.
Well, I had a love affair with South Africa. And so I wanted them to report, but I also wanted them to appreciate this world and the people and the challenges. And, you know, when I started, the first time I went there, I went as an editor of a newspaper with other editors during the apartheid years. We didn't have official visas and so on, but the whole point was we wanted to learn what was going on. And it's a story that continues to be, you know, it hasn't been decided yet what's going to happen to the democracy, so many issues, health issues. So it's an exciting world. It's always been an exciting world for me to be part of and to learn from people. Before I forget, I want to say two things about, because Sam Wrong reminds me of this, and the stories that these students are undertaking remind me is that I learned so much from the students. You know, they weren't learning a hell of a lot from me, but I mean, the stories they were undertaking, it was a wonderful challenge to sort of try to keep up with them, as to, you know, make suggestions or whatever, play people to see or whatever. And in the case of Laura Lopez, who was in the first group of 8, and I think she's still there reporting, and Sam, who went back to report for ETV for at least 2 years. I mean, they were doing so much that was beyond whatever I could have hoped for the students to do, and that I continue to learn from them. You know, it's just, it's wonderful. The other thing I do want to confess is that I noticed there was a bungee jumping student.
Yes, yes.
And it did happen that a student in one of my groups wanted to go bungee jumping. And I was in my 70s at the time, decided, well, this is the time for me to go bungee jump. So we, from 300 feet up, bungee jumped in Soweto together. And I don't think that that dean would have been very happy if he had learned that that's what I was doing with a student. But it was a great experience.
Great experience. I don't think I'll try that, but Doug, how about you?
I think that's why I came along, to protect the students from Lauren's enthusiasm. I think what I wanted for students was some taste of the experience I had growing up. So I came from California, but I grew up really in Taiwan and West Africa and Brazil. And so the main reason I came to Medill was because I wanted to teach in a magazine program, but the selling point was Lauren at the end of the last interview saying, and oh, there's this thing I started in South Africa.
And we're going to get to that, actually.
If you can come, you can be in it. What I wanted was for them to have some experience of what it's like to report your way into a global consciousness, and to flip the script of everything they thought they know about the way the world worked, to really see things from the angle of 70% of humans on the globe living in the global south, between the Tropic of Cancer and Tropic of Capricorn, 70% of the human beings alive on the globe, right? And to be able to go there, have this triple level challenge of writing and producing stories that were valuable to a South African audience. That it's a profound challenge that they took on for 10 weeks of study and 10 weeks of doing. And, you know, I honestly thought he was a little crazy to start it. And I thought I was a little crazy to take up the challenge. I wouldn't have imagined that it would last for 20 years. And the main reason it's lasted for as long as it's lasted is Ava, Professor Greenwell, 10 years ago. In a similar way, having a kind of handoff and doing it together the way Lauren and I did.
Even the flag had to pause for that for a minute, right?
No, I mean, a remarkable experience. So the other thing I would say, I'm probably getting ahead of the script, is that in addition to it being a profound experience for students to be together taking up this challenge, it's been a profound experience to work with colleagues in a way we don't often get to work together. And I mean, the kinds of real deal conversations we've had across all kinds of lines of difference with each other, the three of us, and with Ariane, it's a profound, life-changing experience to be able to engage in a project like this.
You are so right, and you are prophetic, because some of what you said actually is coming up, but a little bit more. But before we get to that, what's really important to know is the people, the editors that we work with in South Africa, we would not be able to do what we do had it not been for those editors. And so we just have a snippet, just a sampling of some of them.
Hi everyone, Bureau Trump here from the Organized Crime and Corruption Reporting Project, where I'm Africa editor. 20 years since the South African Journalism Residency Program. Wow, it's been some time. I've been fortunate to have seen the program grow from its inception 20 years ago, when I was still a junior reporter at the August newspaper in Cape Town. I think the thing that impressed me the most about many of the journalists, of the student journalists who came from Medill, was that they were very willing to go and dive in, to sometimes make fools of themselves, as we all do when we start out, and to try and come to grips with this very tumultuous place that we call home, South Africa. They got to enjoy some of the most important historic events in our contemporary history. They also got to understand, without any varnish, that race permeates everything that happens in our country, and likely where they come from also. They got to see the highs and lows. They got to enjoy action reporting. They got to enjoy political reporting. And I think what we also got in exchange was, sometimes as journalists, we tend to navel gaze. And having these young people from outside of our country engaging in our newsroom, taking part in our conferences, they offered a different perspective, an invaluable perspective. So to all the people who have brought this program along over the past 20 years, I salute you and I thank you. And congratulations to all the people who have come through this program, many of whom I still am in touch with and who work for international news organizations all over the world. Here's to 20 more years, and well done.
Good evening, and congratulations, Medill School of Journalism, on 2 decades of an outstanding journalism program. My name is Paula Frey, and I am the founder of Frey Intermedia and Frey College in Johannesburg, South Africa. As such, I have been honored to have had a front row seat to observe the achievements of Northwestern's Medill School of Journalism in offering fantastic reporting opportunities to students. Since Frey Intermedia first started supporting the South African Journalism Residency program, we have met and hosted the annual cohorts and supported their internship in a range of print, radio, television, and online publications. I'm not surprised that some of these students now hold top positions in some of the most recognizable news organizations in America. We have watched as the students have dived in to busy newsrooms to tell stories that many of their peers would have had to wait years to tackle. Many of them have kept in contact as foreign correspondents, and a number of them have returned to South Africa with other fellowships to continue their storytelling. The Medill School of Journalism's residential program is much more than an opportunity to build up a portfolio of stories. It is an opportunity for students to immerse themselves in communities whose stories often don't make the front pages of American media. And it allows them to challenge whose stories matter and why they matter. Frey Intermedia and myself hope to partner with you for many more decades to come.
Like I said, we couldn't do it without folks in the newsrooms there. Go ahead. Go ahead.
I just want to add a couple of things. So often the students are expected to go into the townships where languages were spoken that they did not know. And so there had to be a partnership between, let's say, a photographer and the Medill student. And so at the reporting level, the students were dependent on these relationships. And then Paula Frey and Beauregard both came here to Medill to help teach the preparatory course that the students were required to take. And I always thought that was important, that when our students went there, that they, I used to ask them to memorize every country in Africa and put it on a map. I expected them to have some basic knowledge of the continent and the country, and to not be ignorant, you know, to care enough. And I think it meant something to the editors there that they came in with at least some basic knowledge, that we had made an effort to diminish their ignorance and our ignorance. So there was something else I was going to say, but I've forgotten it, so that's the way it is.
Okay, well, hopefully it'll come back to you. Doug, did you want to add anything? Okay, all right. So what's also really important is the history of this program. and how it even got to Medill in the first place.
And then when I left putting out this dinky daily in Southbridge and became a journalism educator, I moved to Emory in 1995 and became a professor there and the head of the program that they were restarting. I said, hey, let's get the students to South Africa. And so let's see, that was also, you know, I was influenced by the heroic figures, Nelson Mandela, and he'd been in prison for more than 2 decades. And it was inspiring. South Africa was inspiring to me. It also raised a lot of questions. What was going to happen to the democracy? Was it going to survive? How was race going to be dealt with? I mean, you know, were whites going to just completely leave the country? Was the government going to be able to somehow integrate white and black members of the society? After 3 years, I moved to USC and surprised decided to start a South African program.
You had done it at USC. What was it about bringing it to Northwestern? Was it easier by that time since you had already done the other 2 programs?
Well, yes and no. I mean, some of the challenges, which I'll now list, just followed me everywhere. You know, the financial challenge. How are you going to raise the money? And also, frankly, Medill, I think it was a fairly self-satisfied environment. Why do you want to take students to South Africa? I remember talking to a recruiter at the Chicago Tribune saying, well, you know, it's less appealing to me to have, you want to bring me a student who's, you know, worked in South Africa. Well, I would prefer a student who's worked at a US newsroom. And I was sort of shocked. My attitude was, if they can deal with South Africa, by God, they can certainly deal with whatever Chicago is going to throw at them.
Those key things that Lauren has mentioned in terms of both the perceived value of the program, the reason I got involved with it and stuck with it for these 19 years, it has to do with the foundation that Lauren laid. And I think he teed up for us the key tension from the beginning of the program, which is that, of course, we were mostly thinking about what the value would be to our students of going to South Africa and reporting from a place where the demography that they'd been living in the US was completely upended. And that as a result of that, they would be upended in the way they saw similar stories, as Lauren said, back here. It's almost like seeing things through the other end of the telescope. And in particular, taking students to South Africa meant that we were inviting them to see the world, including the United States, from the point of view of 70% of the world's population, which is in the global South. I was hired to come into a magazine program, and I did that. I've taught in that program the whole time. But the selling point was this chance for me, as somebody who had lived in Africa and West Africa as a child, a chance to get back to the continent. It was also a kind of spiritual obligation that I felt I owed to one of the most important mentors in my life, Roger Wilkins, who was the sponsor and the lead organizer and the lead guide for Nelson Mandela when he came to the US in 1990. The book, completely unplanned, unintended. I had an entirely different project in mind. When I came, I started the first spring. I went and stayed for the spring. And that led to both a realization, I'm in this place 10 years into democracy. I should not just be preparing my students to report on it, I should be reporting on it. So I started writing pieces for the LA Times. I did a piece for the Columbia Journalism Review about what it looked like in a newsroom where all of these colored and Black journalists were coming into the newsroom.
And I think like you, Doug, you know, having traveled there many times, and also I remember, Lauren, when you used to bring in some folks from Chicago, you know, what really struck me was, wow, there are lots of people in the Chicago area who were actively involved in the anti-apartheid movement. And even though I knew it peripherally, I didn't really know it. And so as they began coming to the class, they began sharing names of other people who had done this. And I said, like you, Doug, as you were working on spending time there and writing your book, I said, I need to be productive here. And so every time I would go, you know, maybe within the last 5 years, I started doing interviews or learning about people who lived in South Africa, but at one time lived in Chicago. And that became really the theme for the documentary Mandela in Chicago, and just interviewing as many people in Chicago for the film. I mean, one of the things that has been really important to me is to allow people to speak their truth while they still can. And so as a result of doing the doc, by that time, a lot of those people were in their 70s, you know, close to 80. And of many of the people that I interviewed for the documentary, at least 6 of them have died since the documentary was filmed. So it has been a joy for me because I've had an opportunity to learn while the students learn. I would say my contribution beyond the documentary and the Chicago focus was also maybe a little bit more focused on culture and music. So one of the assignments that I give the students is to focus on some artists and also their role in activism, because art also becomes activism in a very productive way, particularly when we think about the long history and the long suffering, really, that Black and colored South Africans had to endure as they were going through apartheid.
Yeah, I was optimistic about it continuing. I mean, because of Doug and you know, I mean, it seemed to me you got the bug too, and you got enthusiastic, and that's what it is. I mean, I think the faculty members transmitting their enthusiasm and their engagement. It wasn't just that you were taking students, you were doing your own learning.
Well, I feel that we owe the same opportunity to young South African journalists that our students get. I think that we owe, you know, if a funder was to endow the program, I would prioritize as a part of the budget, bringing an equivalent number of South African or African journalists in general. It wouldn't have to be limited to South Africans, to Chicago for an equivalent experience, for at least a 10 or 11 week experience of being able to attend some classes, spend time at the Sun-Times and WBEZ, spend some time with City Bureau, and see the journalism ecosystem of a city in the US.
And obviously the students give because, you know, they get some free labor in the newsrooms, but they also get some cultural competency that they bring back to the United States that, again, is valuable. And if we consider that to be valuable, then I think we should continue to think about what are the ways that we can actually make something work. So Doug, I know it was really important for me to get that part in because we have been talking about this for quite a while, and that is how does reciprocity work, right? Our students get some great experience and exposure while they're in South Africa, but the other is not necessarily true. So say more about that.
Well, it's a bigger than Medill, of course, that challenge. And when we had a dinner for a South African Supreme Court justice at the president's house some years ago, we raised it, the question of reciprocity. And the response was, this was a really nice dinner, and basically crickets since then. And I think it's a profound question for us. We've had 20 years of experience of a program, who knows whether it'll continue and for how long, but whether or not it continues, we've now had 20 years of that kind of experience that you saw, the kind of experience that Sam had, tremendous value. that South Africans have granted us, including access to their stories. And so I do feel this weight of a debt that needs to be repaid. Yeah.
Reparations?
It's a debt. It's definitely a debt. Yeah.
Laura?
I don't have an easy answer. I mean, it's a lot of it's financial. I remember when they started the Emory program, I thought, well, we have to have a South African journalist come for the entire preparatory semester. Then at Emory, it was a full semester. And it was a great experience, although Newton Kanema was so controversial in South Africa that they refused to let him return as a journalist after the Emory experience. And I worked with him to get some fellowships, and he was employed in the United States after that and elsewhere, but not in South Africa. I don't know. I just want to say positively that I've thought a great deal about why the program survives here and not elsewhere. And so on the plus side, I'd like to say that the funders of international programs here, and I'm don't have the title in the front of my brain right now, certainly with Doug's help at a crucial time, stepped forward and helped us make sure that the program continued when it wasn't necessarily top of mind of the dean at that point. And but the school has also been supportive, and the fact, and I think a crucial element is the two of you, and also the Chicago community. Funika came in and encouraged the students to undertake cooking South African foods, and that was one of the classes that I delighted in most, because it was like a competition who could do the best job cooking South African food. But to go to the question of culture, it was not only, and I would always start the class by playing South African music, a different musician each time. So all of that's important. So it was, and Carol, so this Chicago community supported the course, and thank you, Charles, for letting me come today. Medill is certainly supporting the course now, so there's a lot of help that this program has had from a variety of sources at Northwestern, at Medill, and I'm thankful for that.
So speaking of Chicago, we do have some special guests who are going to join us on the stage shortly. But as you know, we're here not only to celebrate the 20th anniversary of South Africa JR, but also the 30th anniversary of Nelson Mandela's visit to Chicago. And so we're going to take a listen and a look at an excerpt from the documentary. It runs about 12 minutes. And then we're going to have our special guests come to the stage who are both featured in the documentary and talk a little bit about that Chicago connection.
My name is Harold Rogers.
My name is Joan Gehrig.
My name is Prexy Nesbitt from Chicago, Illinois, from the west side.
Well, I'm Mike Saviwe Elliott.
I am Dr. Iva Carruthers. My name is Carol Mosley Braun. I grew up on the south side of Chicago.
There was a time when I filmed Nelson Mandela. It's called Labor Welcomes Mandela to Chicago.
I first heard about apartheid when I was in Nigeria.
And so I learned about South Africa as a child, really.
Free South Africa!
Comrades, I bring you the greetings of the African National Congress.
There was no question we had to bring him to Chicago because in 1990 he hadn't come to Chicago. So in 93, recognizing that absence, he made this trip. It was very important.
This is a great day for our city.
Job is partially done, but it isn't finished yet.
He gave this incredible speech.
You have been the source of strength.
He was like a teacher, and we were all like in his classroom.
I first became aware of this concept of apartheid really being trained as a sociologist, working on a doctorate at Northwestern University.
I first learned about apartheid doing a paper in 6th grade for the 6th grade class at Francis Parker School.
I first became involved with the ANC in 1968 when I was living in Tanzania.
I first heard about apartheid when I was in Nigeria teaching in 1970, and that's when it started to become real.
My grandfather was a follower of Marcus Garvey, and he believed that black folks should learn all the skills they could and take it back to develop Africa, because he said, we'll never get any respect here.
I had no idea at the time that the struggle against apartheid in South Africa and the struggle for civil rights here in the States were on such parallel tracks. 3 critical constructs that we studied was race, class, and power. And in that context, whenever you wanted to globalize that conversation, there was always a comparison made to apartheid in South Africa, segregation in the United States, and the caste system in India.
Black South Africans in South Africa looked very highly on Black Americans because of the civil rights movement.
With the rise of Black power in the United States, we were talking about Black consciousness. It was important to get the Black communities to be aware of themselves and to refuse to accept second-rate status as citizens of this country. Ultimately, we got arrested for that.
Remember, we came out of South Africa and there was such censorship. Remember, we were not supposed to sing the national anthem because they perceived it as a song that was instigating something. The people here knew it. They knew our heroes. They knew more of our heroes than we did.
The connection between Black Americans and Black South Africans goes back to the 1800s.
There were African Americans in South Africa as early as 1819, and they were there as sailors. A major part of the commercial trading sailor network was African American. That early group of people, were treated differently than Black South Africans, but they still recognized what was going on in terms of the way that Black South Africans were treated.
The enslaved sailor on the left traveled to South Africa on this Confederate ship called the Alabama. There's even a South African song dedicated to the ship. Sailor Yankee Wood was a ship steward before settling in South Africa after the Civil War. Wood made money during Johannesburg's gold rush in the 1880s and purchased hotels. In 1890, musician Orpheus McAdoo and Virginia's Hampton University Jubilee Singers spent 5 years in South Africa performing show tunes and spirituals.
Coming for
to carry me home. If you get there before I do, coming for to carry me home.
By the early 1900s, Black Baptist and African Methodist Episcopal churches sent missionaries to live with South Africans to teach the Bible and care for orphans.
The AME church began to be banned inside South Africa because the South African state began to see them as encouraging opposition to the way that Black South Africans were being treated.
And Black newspapers and magazines such as the Indianapolis Freeman, the Colored American, and Marcus Garvey's Negro World circulated in Johannesburg, espousing a message of Black liberation.
There were some Garveyites inside of South Africa, even though it too was a banned organization.
Given these historical connections, it's not surprising that when the offspring of enslaved African Americans moved north to Chicago as part of the Great Migration, they strongly identified with Black South Africans who were forced to live under a strict system of racial separation and inequality called apartheid.
It's a horrible system that defines people as superior or inferior on the basis of how they look. So you don't care about the content of the people, and because we are inferior, everything for us has to be inferior.
Fast forward to the 1970s when Black South Africans started coming to Chicago regularly.
Made a list the other day of the some 78 different South Africans who stayed in my house on the west side of Chicago.
In 1973, there was a conference held here at Dunbar High School. It was a founding of an organization called the National Anti-Imperialist Movement in Solidarity with African Liberation. One of the speakers was Oliver Tambo. That was an electrifying experience.
Oliver Tambo preceded Nelson Mandela as president of the African National Congress while living in exile for 3 decades. It was only after Nelson Mandela was released from a life sentence for plotting to overthrow the white racist government that Tambo was able to return to South Africa.
It was a learning experience to actually speak to people who had actually been on the ground in South Africa and who had experienced pretty much some of the same things that I had experienced growing up in the South.
And there were so many public forums and educational activity and a constant thrust of keeping the eye on this brutal regime of a minority European descended population in control of a majority Black country that just seemed outlandish in the minds of everyday people.
Here in the Chicago area, we have 22 different anti-apartheid organizations.
We had a committed grouping of people who were very versed in the relationship and how it all came together with the struggle in this country and the struggle in Southern Africa.
When I'm talking to people about Southern Africa is to make the connections between what's going on in Chicago and what's going on in Southern Africa.
We in Chicago have always had a diversity of movement building in relationship to the injustices that Black people have had to fight. You had the center of the Nation of Islam here. You had the center of the National Baptist Convention here. You couldn't have had more opposites, right?
But it's the people, how they dedicated themselves to our struggle as if they were experiencing the pain and the hurt of the people of South Africa. Of course, I suppose in some way it was easier for them since they were not so free after all.
We would say freeing South Africa is freeing ourselves.
Northern style white supremacists allowed for Black people here not to ever forget who they were in relationship to the systems of white supremacy. And it's the rawness of Chicago. It was the clear separation. You could literally, as a sociologist, look at the ethnic communities and you could literally cross the street and know you were in a different zone. and you could feel it, you could smell it, you could experience it. So it was up south for real.
The Free South Africa signs were an idea of Trans-Africa, and it was an idea to sell these signs, to put in front of churches and other places, partially as a fundraiser, but mostly as an educational tool. People would ride past and say, what, Free South Africa from what?
Child is dying in Soweto, and still our policy of constructive engagement does not vary one bit. The child is dying in Chicago, and we go right on getting high, selling coke and buying coke, using dope and wondering what's wrong with these children.
Trinity United Church of Christ in 1980 put up the first in Illinois, if not in the nation, Free South Africa sign.
Only cost $100. Bought the sign, put it up.
He blatantly had his big sign right out in front of the church. That made a real political statement.
Now my disappointment and frustration, and I mailed 3,000 postcards asking them to join me. I just asked the storefront, you don't have to stick it in the ground, you can put it in the window. I got 0 responses in terms of, okay, we'll do it.
Child is dying in Angola, and some of us don't know where that is. Child is dying in Mozambique, and most of us don't care where that is.
So I'm happy to say, thrilled to say that the documentary aired on PBS, Channel 11, in both 2021 and 2022. And today, on Freedom Day, it was also screened in Johannesburg at the Bioscope Theater. So, 50 minutes. It's still on WTTW's website if you're interested in watching the whole thing. Now I would like to invite our special guests, Funeka Shushali and Basil Clooney, to the stage. These are the stalwart folks who don't necessarily get all the attention, but were involved in Chicago's anti-apartheid movement very deeply. So let's give them a hand, because the work that they did not get any pay for that work, right? Hold on. That's right, pick up the flag. Thank you so much. Yes, and so I'm gonna start with Basil, because you were one of the co-founders of CITSA, the Coalition for Illinois Divestment in South Africa. Is it on here? Just take mine.
Yeah, thank you very much, and thank you everybody for inviting us here. I'd like to make one slight correction. I was one of the co-chairs, not one of the co-founders. It was Cheryl Odom, and who in fact, who I graduated with in undergraduate school, who called me one day and said, "Negro, why aren't you with us in CITSA?" And I said, "What is that?" She said, "It's the Coalition for Illinois Divestment from South Africa." All right, let me be very brief. I want to talk a little bit about how we saw our work. During the worldwide campaign against the support against the South African apartheid regime, we in Illinois, in the Coalition for Illinois Divestment from South Africa, concentrated on 3 things. Number 1, raising consciousness about the nature of apartheid and its basic injustice to Black Africans. It also included raising consciousness about Africa itself. As people had said earlier, as Mike said in the video, for many people, Africa was a country and not a continent of nations. And the history of colonial oppression. Secondly, we wanted to highlight how apartheid disenfranchised and hurt us here as well, economically, socially, and politically, as well as it did in South Africa. And lastly, we wanted to create pressure on our elected representatives in the Illinois legislature to first declare their votes, because back at that time, especially down in Springfield, if people had a controversial vote, they wouldn't vote aye or nay, they'd vote present and get credit for being there without declaring themselves. So we had to divide folks into friends and enemies and pressure the enemies and support the friends. Progressively on the divestment bill that was developed by Woods Bowman, who was a congressman right here from Illinois, as well as Cara Mosley Braun. Okay, our group consisted of activists who were educators, health providers, artists, creatives, clergy, union people. And in that, we worked with other groups as well as specifically the Illinois Labor Network Against Apartheid. Okay, in the first instance, that of raising consciousness, we were engaged in debating corporate and conservative religious representatives on radio and TV shows. I think several times I was on the Callaway show on WTTW against people from the 700 Club and Caterpillar and places like that whose basically whose approach was that South African apartheid wasn't that bad, that the Africans wanted them there. So the same kind of bourgeois we used to hear from people in the South saying that, why are you northern carpetbaggers coming down here? Our Negroes are very happy. We also informed others about events in and around South Africa which were not being reported by mainstream media, and hosting speaking tours for activist visitors from South and Southern Africa who would come through the Midwest and Chicago specifically. Many of these people were supported financially in these trips through the United States by two major national anti-apartheid groups, the Washington Office on Africa and New York's ACOA, the American Committee on Africa. I worked with the ACOA before moving out here as a graduate student. And also organizing people who were in unions, block clubs, colleges, high schools, churches, and synagogues. All of these areas were various sectors of our local society that would help spread the word and bring that kind of word about what was happening in South Africa more to us. I want to just say very briefly that we owe a great debt of gratitude to our recently departed former head of Trans-Africa, Randall Robinson, who devised the idea of having sit-ins at South African consulates and embassies around the country and having celebrities be arrested so that the news would formally carry that. And that began the television news in the United States of what was happening in South Africa so people could see for themselves what was happening there.
And Harry Belafonte, too, want to add that.
Yes, absolutely,
because
yes.
his recent death
yes.
also reminds us.
Right.
Yeah.
An example of the second kind of initiative, that of showing how the South African apartheid disenfranchised us here as well, was our informing others about the fact that the State of Illinois building, which is in downtown Chicago, that orange and blue semicircle, whatever, was constructed of South African steel at virtually the same time that people were throwing hundreds of Illinois steel workers being laid off from Southworks in southeastern Chicago. And when we began to, some of the lawyers on our group began to really push that fact, both in the City Council of Chicago and elsewhere, it became more aware to people that it wasn't just an issue that you should think about because it was a morally right thing to do, but we were actually hurting our own relatives and friends here. Lastly, the idea of pressure on our elected representatives. We had several campaigns, including downstate trips throughout Illinois, which competed with corporate adversaries such as Caterpillar in telling our story about how investments by Illinois companies, banks and union pension funds, directly aided the apartheid regime. In some cases, especially with the union pension funds, which I'm thinking of three major ones, the teachers union, the fire and police union, they average about $8.5 billion at the time. Some of those funds were being invested in South Africa, but many of them were not making the same kind of money that they could make being invested here. And that odd conjunction was something that really helped to turn some things around. So those were the three areas that we were trying to concentrate on during this 8 to 10 year struggle. Actions such as these by activists in every state in the Union culminated in the override of President Reagan's veto of the South African divestment bill. It passed the Congress in 1986.
So a lot of hard work. I want to go, thank you, and thank you for that, really, because you are living history, and you're still able to tell it. And I think it's so important to hear it from the people who experienced it. Funeka, I wonder what your reflections are. It's hard to believe that it's been almost 30 years since Nelson Mandela was in Chicago. So you have lived in both worlds. You grew up in South Africa, but you also have made a life in the Chicago area.
Well, to start with, thank you, all of you. South Africa is a country full of contradictions.
Move the mic up a little bit more, please, so we can make sure everybody can hear you.
South Africa is a country full of contradictions, and having lived under apartheid can confuse you sometimes. I'm thinking, as I'm listening to the students, that they're fortunate they were never labeled honorary whites, which means that, or which meant that even if they went to Soweto, their companions and the people who are supposed to translate for them would have to be over there and sort of signal to them. At least very little is lost in translation now because they can stay with them. We were talking earlier about, for instance, the contradiction of funerals in South Africa. Make sure you have provision for the whole day. If you go to an African funeral, it's even better than a wedding. So I was discussing that. But the culture is so different. Financial differences, agricultural differences, climate differences. Across, when we were observing, or when they were observing apartheid, the Bantu stands were carved so that the dry areas would be given to Africans. So this table could be carved 6 ways. On this side, if it's green, it could be white, and if this area is arid and dry, it would be black, and then again, this would be the same country for whatever. Well, we know why. Finances and health, somebody's from the CDC. It's very difficult to translate the disparities. I'll give you an old example. For instance, Nestle brought milk to South Africa and discouraged mothers from breastfeeding. Do you remember that? But they did not know where the women would be getting water from. So they would get water even if it was not from clean supplies. So the kids were dying from this new innovation of mixing powdered milk with dirty water. Those are details people don't get to know. All they know is that the Africans are resisting help. Most of the time, there would be little or no education. CDC, with research, maybe they're doing research, and they need to obtain consents. They do like, what is that, Reverend Moon? All of you here agree to participate in this study. We will compensate you 20 rands. That is a lot of money. They do that, very little explanation about side effects and all of that. The outside world does not get those details. Valas the other day said something crazy about, think about a black father who goes home and has to explain to the father why he's not successful. Think about an African man who's supposed to be a man banging his chest at home. I'm the guy here. And he goes to work and he's called a pickaninny. Pickaninny is a pickaninny even here? Okay. That undermining, operating out of
two systems and tell me how those people are still supposed to be sane. But we were, because we had love, we kept together, we took care of each other. Josephine, one of your students, was interested in finding out what gives us joy. I'm also curious what kept us so I don't want to say happy, but we were joyful enough in spite of everything. I know, being taught in my own family that, and I was cute and small then, but I think my father used to tell us, if you have to receive anything from a white person, if it's less than 20 pounds, take it with one hand, even if it kills you. But if we had to get this from an African elder, that's when you use both hands. Now, psychologically, colonizers find you undesirable if you don't look them in the eye. It's discourteous and disrespectful in our culture to face elders like that. So we had to learn, my father and my mother. No, my parents used to, look at their hair, they don't know what you're looking at. So we always had to have these double standards. Everything was difficult. I remember areas where it was white by night. If you went there, even to work, I was a nurse, I was trained in South Africa, and I did private duty. If you left at 7, by 8 o'clock, the white areas were supposed to be white by night, unless you're doing the other job, that is, you're a prostitute, or you are a nanny. And we had to run out of those areas. So I was in America for 4 years, and I had gained some guts, I think. I thought I could face the police. And I was in Rosebank. And I see this young white policeman in mufti. Mufti is private clothing. And he's leaning against the wall, and he says, hey, come here. And hey, I'm Americanized now. I'm like, what? Who you think you're talking to? Then I looked, and I saw a gun. I knew I was back in South Africa. I was like, yes. He says, pass, where's your DOM pass? And I hadn't carried a pass in 4 years. I had to look for my passport. You should have seen me screaming at him. How dare you? You don't even have uniform. Meanwhile, I am scared because I'm thinking I'm back home now. So, shifting back and forth, that's how we had to survive. I'm impressed when people talk about food deserts. That was the norm. We knew that we didn't have to have names for some of these things. So what you experience as young students is very fascinating to me because it's nothing we lived through. I can't even adjust when I go home because everything is new. The born frees that's a new term. Doug is familiar with it. But those are things I don't know. They rub shoulders with whites at clubs. No, I was used to whites only and colors. There was no mention of blacks. We knew we had no place, we had to run. if I have to say a little bit about the documentary, most of the people, Basil and them, knew our struggle because they formed relationships with people. Therefore, they could trace the progress and the processes. They understood what was going on. Just having interaction with people for a short period, what do they say? They say, one swallow does not a summer make. You have now inherited part of South Africa, and you have an obligation to keep on going back. We want you to keep on going back. You are cousins now, whether you want it or not, and you have that responsibility to go back there and understand and solve what's going on.
Wow, that is a big charge, right? So I have two work study students here. I'd like you to come forward if you have some questions. So let me just say, too, I want to thank the two work study students that I've had this year, Kunjal Bastola and Ananya Chug. They put together all these videos. They conducted the interviews. They were just wonderful. And I know I pushed you a little bit toward the end, but I just want to say thank you publicly for all the hard work you put in putting this together. Let's give them a hand. So if you have a question, just raise your hand. If you have a question, just raise your hand, and they will get the mic to you, because remember, we're recording this, and we want to make sure we capture it.
Thank you, Dale Greenwell, Ava's husband. Lauren, you said something that was interesting about the first time that you started this program. And you talked about some of the challenges, but what was the main challenge that you faced? I know financial challenge of taking students, and also the responsibility of taking students. How did that weigh on you, and how did you overcome some of those challenges?
One thing that comes to mind from your question is that something Doug and I would say to each other. There were muggings of students, and there were issues of safety, and we worried about if anything serious happened, the program would be dead. That the university, I mean, there's an uneasiness, frankly, at certain levels for understandable reasons about, what's going to happen to the students. I remember it was an automobile accident, somebody broke a finger or whatever. And, it worked out all right, but I was worried about that. So that's on one level the kind of thing that I worried about. And it was amazing to me, just to go back to the beginning of the programs at Emory, where Archbishop Tutu was a respected guest for, we would go to Emory. But Emory had like the highest percentage of African American students of any university in the Atlanta area, other than HBCUs. And yet, the thought of having a program in Africa, you would think this was some crazy idea. The students were interested, and so I hope that's the response to it.
I thought, having read Douglas's book, I thought so much more would have happened in South Africa by now, and things you've said looking back, that if you had to envision South Africa 5 years from now, what would you say might happen that would make it better?
Thanks for that idea for another book. That's a really good question. I'm better at immersive explanatory journalism in the moment than making predictions, but I think, you know, in general, one of the reasons why I love doing the reporting I'm doing in the Midwest and teaching about South Africa and staying in touch is I think things are in the balance. You know, it's not just that if you know, people have the kind of, students have the kind of experience Sam had, you come back thinking in the same way that we usually think about the rest of the world, which is some comparative basis where what's happening in the US is the default. Often what's happening in the rest of the world is a hint about what's going to happen here. So if you look, for example, at Jacob Zuma's presidency, a leader, authoritarian populist who couldn't understand the difference between his family's interest, his party's interest, and the national interest. That happens in South Africa in 2009. It happens here 7 years later. So I think that, you know, when we talk about how do you get a global consciousness about what may be ahead, sometimes it's from going more deeply here. Sometimes it's by paying attention to Berlusconi in Italy, to Jacob Zuma, to Donald Trump, for example. So I'm a deeply gloomy person, as you know, in general, but very optimistic about the prospect that young people will wiggle their way out. If you had said to me when I was the age of the students we teach now, that, you know, one day Ireland was going to still be in flames and there would be a democratic transformation in South Africa. Hasn't solved every problem, but that would happen, that Nelson Mandela would be freed, that there would be an election, that there would be a largely peaceful transition, I would have said, you're crazy. If you had said, if you had a Marxist analysis of the Middle East, you know, about the resources available there, and that what would be happening right now in Palestine would be happening, but South Africa would be relatively free, I would have said you were crazy. So it depends on, democracy as a verb. Just like for us, what happens in South Africa is dependent on South Africans understanding that.
I was going to say, pass the mic, please, because I know you have relatives, your sister that you're talking with regularly. What is your perspective?
I think apartheid was so embedded in that wall that the pendulum swung so far and it bounced and got into that other wall. It's going to take time before it steadies. Hopefully, whatever comes won't get embedded again in the wall. It will swing back until, I don't think it will be within 5 years, though.
Yes,
We have a long way to go.
On stage.
There's just too much going on.
That's Cheryl.
Cheryl Otto?
Yes. All right, Cheryl. All right, bye.
Do you have a question?
You are, in fact, an interviewer.
So it's going to take time, but as we also get exposed and learn from you, we're going to improve. But before we steady that pendulum, it's going to take time.
I agree with you. I think we need to recognize the fact that in South Africa, as in so many other places, especially in the global South, that the incidence and pervasiveness of abject poverty is a constant push towards low-level crime and dysfunction in society. And the other side of it, of course, is, as you mentioned earlier with the Zuma leadership and others, is the pendulum of leadership. One of the few hopes that I have for a country like South Africa is whether, in fact, NGOs led by women's groups and things like that are going to achieve any kind of traction of any sort. It's a huge, it's a huge problem, but there's something else happening on an even larger level, and that is that we're going through a transition in this next couple of decades between the worldwide presence of the dollar as the national thing and the BRICS, Brazil, South Africa, India, China, and left out Russia, that their currency push is already larger than the G7 and is going to and is increasing that way, and that's going to have huge effects not only on the global South but on how those societies evolve. So we have a lot of things to think about, but the real problem, again, as I say, that abject poverty is something which is a driving force that is so difficult to get around.
Well, we're going to have to wrap here. I thank you all so much for being here, but before we wrap, we're going to have some, oh, there was a question? Okay, go ahead.
Oh, sorry, I don't mean to keep us.
No, go ahead. We want questions from students.
Oh, I'm a postdoc fellow. My name is Amanda Joyce Hall. I'm a postdoc fellow in the African American Studies Department, and I'm a historian of anti-apartheid. And I just want to thank you all for this really rich panel that ties the past to the present, tees up questions for the future, ties African America to South Africa, and vice versa. I had a few questions. Maybe we can only get to like one, but I'll just throw them out there. For the activists on the stage, I was interested in learning about the unity or the disunity among Chicago anti-apartheid groups. And I know that this is something that's teed up in the documentary. I don't think we saw that.
That's correct.
That
yes.
clip. But I'm wondering if these were all divisions that were happening among regional lines, if maybe you could speak more to some of the ideological differences as well between the different groups. I think that that's interesting, and maybe if this had to do with alignment with different African liberation groups such as the ANC or the Black Consciousness Movement or the PAC. Another question I had was just about, since this is a journalism program, I'm interested in the ways that reporting on South Africa has changed over time. And I think of two pivotal moments in South African history that were internationalized, and that would be the Sharpeville Massacre of 1960 and the Soweto Uprising of 1976. And I just wonder, sort of, did you all feel that those were moments that were appropriately reported on in the United States or internationally after they happened? Were these moments that, in your own personal journeys to kind of like your political, I guess, development over time, were these things that radicalized you? So there's that. And then finally, for Dr. Ava Thompson-Greenwald, I really, really love this documentary. And I just wonder about how you did it, and if you could speak maybe to some of the challenges of trying to wrap your hands around such a huge kind of like history, and then some of the things that were most gratifying for you in producing the documentary and directing. Okay,
I'm going to have Basil, if you will address the... Oh, you're going to...
We're going to let you answer the third one.
Okay, right, I'll do that. So real quickly, because I was going to say, Basil, maybe you address the political aspects of those groups since you were involved. So just real quickly, I'll say I call it a labor of love. It debuted on February 14th, Valentine's Day, on WTTW. And the reason is because it was a lot of work, right? Because you're trying to pull together. But I will say I believe in divine intervention because everything began to fall into place as I began to do the work, right? So in the beginning, I wondered, well, what's my B-roll going to be? Well, it turned out, it turned out that Columbia College had just released on its website 40 hours worth of video that had been shot by Mike Elliott, who was the unofficial videographer. He is in the documentary at the beginning where he talks about Marcus Garvey. He unfortunately passed away about 2 years ago. But the fact that they said, you can have this for free was fantastic, because if you know anything about video production, it's very expensive to get at this archival footage. And I think that was probably the hardest part. So that footage that you saw of Oliver Tambo, putting on the scarf, those 30 seconds cost $1,500. 30 seconds of video. So I think the cost factor for archival video, that was probably the greatest challenge.
Thank you for those questions. It's a semester course you're talking about. Anyway, briefly, in the Chicago area especially, SIDS of the Coalition of Illinois Divestment from South Africa and its successor, the Chicago Committee in Solidarity with Southern Africa, was a group that was primarily, in this country, we'd call it multiracial. In South Africa, they call it non-racial. And we had some difficulties with one or two groups on, one group I'm thinking of specific on the South Side that was not with the Congress Alliance, that is not with the South African or the ANC and whatnot. They were more or less PAC supporters, and they were nationalists in the sense that they could not understand why we had white and Jewish members and whatnot in our organization, for instance. That was more, I think, with their own local nationalist orientation rather than anything more larger than that. I wouldn't call it disunity so much, but rather differences of approaches, because there were very few instances where we had any kind of conflicts from, between groups and stuff. But it did reflect very much the segregation that we find in Chicago neighborhoods, and also the the kind of orientation that people have towards folks of different backgrounds. You can go 10 blocks, as somebody mentioned, Chicago, and you're in a completely different environment, and you might think you're in a completely different country.
And then that other question in the middle? Oh, media representation. Does anybody want to take that? In terms of, and you're talking about in terms of how it has changed, right, over time?
And the influence on us. I think that the coverage of Sharpeville and the uprising in Soweto had the same influence for me, I don't know about for others, that the on-the-scene television reporting from Selma across the South, when older brothers and sisters and cousins were going on Freedom Summer, and I was getting reports back and seeing the scale of the violence up close because it was captured. And so that's the power of journalism, to capture what's actually happening and to call for a response.
Yeah, and I think what's different today, though, is, I can go and get, I can see the coverage that's happening from a South African perspective now because of the internet. Couldn't do that before. And so I can show students, look, this is what just happened yesterday, and this is how it's being covered there versus now. So that's a real benefit. Lauren?
I just wanted to mention how heroic the early South African journalists covering a lot of these subjects were. Peter Magubeni, I used to take students to his house because I wanted them to understand what he went through to get the shots that you're talking about. And Joe Chloe also, I'd take students to meet him. These people were often tortured and imprisoned. Yeah, kept in solitude, solitary confinement for not weeks, but years. And so what they did, what you see, I mean, there's another story that needs to be told.
So I think we would like to bring up Dean Charles Whitaker just to give some final remarks, and then we have a reception out in the lobby.
Yeah, I'll be brief because I don't want to keep you from the reception. But first off, thank you, Ava, for putting together this amazing commemoration. It's so important that we take the time to reflect on this. I remember, Medill has a tremendous global footprint right now. We send students actually all over the world, undergraduates and graduate students. But when I was but a child, a baby faculty member 20 years ago, I remember when Lauren came to us with an idea to go to South Africa, and it was not met with skepticism, it was met with derision. We were a very provincial school where the goal was at best to send students to work for the Chicago Tribune. So the idea of sending them around the world was just unthinkable for so many of our colleagues. But while Lauren may look to be a mild and gentle man, he is a man of tremendous fortitude, and he wrestled this faculty into doing that. And we as a school are better served for it. Medill is a much better place because of his vision, and I can't thank you enough for that. Nor can I thank Ava and Doug for the heroic work they have done, keeping Lauren's vision alive. As Doug rightly said, were it not for the two of them, he didn't say it about himself, he said it about Ava, but I will include him. Were it not for the two of them picking up that mantle and carrying this program forward, I'm not so sure that we would continue to have a South Africa program, but also I'm not so sure that we would have seen our way fit to have an Argentina program, to have Medill Explores, to have Medill Journeys. All of those are possible because of the vision and work that you put in to make this possible. Vaneka and Basil, thank you so much for sharing your reflections with us. It is so wonderful to have you with us, to have you help us to remember and also celebrate. And I will say celebrate the history. The history is tough and sometimes tough to face up to, but having this living history, we only get better by remembering the past. And so not to be able to think about the struggle that got us here would be a great oversight on our part. So thank you for all that you have done and all that you continue to do. It's wonderful to have you with us here.